I'm Jessica the Museum Guide, and welcome to one of the most wonderful art galleries in the world, the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square here in London. I'm covering 10 more paintings that you can't miss on your next visit to this gallery, or just to follow along from home. Simply don't know of another art gallery that is as amazing as the National Gallery. Almost exactly 1 year ago, I stood here at the National Gallery and spoke about the top 10 must-see paintings. Now, after guiding at this formidable institution for even longer, I have 10 more paintings that I think anyone visiting this museum needs to prioritize. Remember, I offer private tours of the National Gallery, and I would love to show you around. My contact details are below. If you like this video, I am always grateful when my viewers support my channel. You can do this by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. You can also become a member or leave me a tip on PayPal. I'm at Jessica Tour Guide, or by buying me a coffee. The details are below. Today, we're going to explore the paintings flashing on your screen right now, going in chronological order and starting all the way back in the 1390s with the Wilton Diptych, and finishing in 1891 with Henri Rousseau and his iconic Surprised. So, are you ready to dive into European history and some of the most glorious paintings ever created? Let's go. I've just launched memberships on my channel, so be sure to check out the link below. You'll get all kinds of great perks, including getting my videos at least 2 or 3 days before everybody else does. And you know you want that. Would you be interested if I launched a Patreon with even more great perks? Let me know in the comments below. So we'll start here with a very old panel painting, most likely dating from 1394 to 1399. During the last 5 years of Richard II's reign. This is the most famous English Gothic painting, one of very few to survive the Middle Ages. It's called the Wilton Diptych, named after the house where it was displayed until 1929. We do not know the artist or where it was made, but the most common theories are France or England. It was likely created as a personal piece for Richard II himself, who was King of England from 1377 to 1399. It's painted with egg tempera and gold leaf on 2 panels, connected by a hinge. That makes this piece extremely portable, so Richard could take it with him when campaigning to remind him of his own greatness. It was quite rare at that time to combine secular and religious imagery, but when you're the king, you can do as you please. So on the left, you can see 4 standing figures, and they have been tooled. That is, a tiny punch has been used to hammer a very fine pattern of gold onto the painting. The 3 men are some of England's most important patron saints, and 2 of them Anglo-Saxon kings wearing crowns. Saint Edmund the Martyr on the far left, Saint Edward the Confessor in the middle, and finally, John the Baptist on the right, always portrayed holding the Lamb of God. In front of them, we can see the king himself, adorned in finery and looking rather boyish, perhaps in reference to the fact that he took the throne at the tender age of 11. He's kneeling in prayer in front of these venerated men. Now let's look at some of the other symbols associated with these kings. First of all, Richard's cloak is done in sgraffito, a technique where the artist paints over the gilding and then scratches through to create a pattern. Richard's depicted with a white heart, both onto his robe and around his neck, on a chain of pearls. This is an extremely rare white stag, thought to hold mystical associations to this day. Game of Thrones fans know this well. Now, he may have inherited this symbol from his mother, Joan of Kent, or it may be a pun on his name, as in rich heart. We can also see that Edmund the Martyr's cloak is covered in pelicans, which is a Christian symbol of self-sacrifice, because it was then believed to pierce its own breast with its red-tipped beak and feed its young its own blood. There are still pelicans in St. James Park, just down the street from here. Edmund is carrying the arrow that he was murdered with in 869 or 870. He was captured in battle by pagan Vikings and tied to a tree, shot with arrows, and finally beheaded. According to Abbo of Fleury's 10th century account of the saint's life, his decapitated head was then reunited with his body with the help of a talking wolf, naturally, who called out, "Hic, hic, hic, here, here, here," to alert Edmund's followers, but that's another very strange story for another day. Saint Edward the Confessor is holding a ring, referencing one of his miracles. As he was on his way back from a Mass on the feast day of St. John the Evangelist, he was stopped by a beggar asking for alms. The king had no money. Did you know that to this day it's considered too common for a monarch to handle money? And so he just gave the beggar a ring from his finger. Later, the beggar appeared to 2 pilgrims in Jerusalem and asked them to return the ring to the king, telling them he was actually St. John the Evangelist in disguise. On the right side panel, we see the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, surrounded by 11 angels, which may be a reference to Richard's age when he became king. They are each wearing Richard's emblem, the same white heart. The saints, John, Edmund, and Edward, appear to be presenting the king, and therefore England, to Mary and the Christ child, who is wearing cloth of gold. We can see the very fine details stippled into his halo, the crown of thorns and 3 nails, symbols of his crucifixion. Mary holds up his foot as if to show us where the nails will one day be driven through his flesh, but also so that the king can kiss his foot. Jesus is leaning away from Mary and reaching towards Richard II, creating a poignant moment between the two of them, and therefore between God and England. At the top of the painting, we see the flag of St. George, who is the patron saint of this country. The orb at the top of the flagpole was recently cleaned to reveal a hidden secret of the painting. There is a little island floating in a sea of silver with a little ship, and on the island is a little castle. The silver has since oxidized, but it would have been much brighter. In Shakespeare's play about Richard II, written in 1595, he writes, "This little world, this precious stone set in a silver sea," which has led some historians to wonder if perhaps Shakespeare saw this painting in the royal collection at a time when the orb was still clear. Remember, the painting was already 200 years old at that point. It's a long shot, but it's one hell of a coincidence if not. The entire scene is meant to prove Richard II's divine right to rule. He is flanked by the most pious kings in history and receives a blessing from Christ himself. I mean, it doesn't get more divine than that. No detail has been spared, from the flowers at their feet to the angels' wings and the crowns of roses they wear, in contrast to the crown of thorns referenced in Christ's halo. Let's look at the back of the panels, on what would have been the exterior of the carrying case. It's adorned with larger images that are far less detailed. Here, we see the delightful white stag with a crown around his neck, attached to a gold chain to represent duty to country. The stag is laying in a field of rosemary, which is likely referencing Anne of Bohemia, Richard II's first wife, as well as the irises and pimpernels of his second wife, Isabel of France. On the opposite side, we see the English royal arms of the day, a shield decorated with the fleur-de-lis of France and the badly worn 3 lions of England, and they are impaled with those of Edward the Confessor. Again, remember that this piece was made for private use, and Richard is depicted exactly as he wishes to be seen, flanked with the most important English saints, blessed by Christ, and without the beard and aged appearance of his later years. Instead, he has the bloom of youth. What he doesn't know about what we do is that he will soon be forced to abdicate in favor of his cousin, Henri IV, and he will be imprisoned and starved to death at Pontefract Castle in West Yorkshire. Known mostly for his statues, the great Florentine sculptor Michelangelo was also a painter, and his ethereal paintings are some of my favorites of the Italian Renaissance. Here at the National Gallery, we have 2 unfinished works, which are, in many ways, just as interesting to appreciate as finished works. We can see the artist in action, and it almost feels like we are in the room with him. In this great work, we see Christ's body being carried to his tomb, which is in the rocks behind him. This is one of only 3 Michelangelo panel paintings. The other, the Doni Tondo, is in the Uffizi, and the third is right here on the wall, the Manchester Madonna, my personal favorite, and also unfinished. They are all egg tempera. Unfinished paintings can be exceptionally compelling because there is space left for the divine and the unknown. We can't be sure of the reasons why Michelangelo left it unfinished, but for viewers, it adds a sense of mystery to the composition. For instance, it is unclear how Christ is being supported in this picture. He is flanked by St. John and a woman, likely Mary Cleophas, who cared for Christ as he was dying. It appears that they are carrying him up a staircase to his tomb, but the unfinished details lend a sense of weightlessness to the piece. He almost looks like he's floating on air, despite the fact he is quite literally dead weight. Typically, Christ is carried horizontally, but here he is lifted up vertically and proffered to us, the viewer, so we can see him better. While John the Evangelist, here in red, is complete, the other figures have ghostly outlines and unfinished hands and bodies. For instance, Joseph of Arimathea's head is floating above Christ in a spectral manner, and everything's rather dreamy and surreal. Seated here, we can see Mary Magdalene, and the shape of her hand suggests that Michelangelo may have intended to paint her traditional jar of ointment, which symbolizes healing, although my mom says she looks like she's holding her phone. A preparatory drawing held at the Louvre shows her gazing down at Christ's crown of thorns and crucifixion nails. If we look to the opposite side of the canvas, we can see the absence where the grieving Virgin Mary should be seated. Her immense grief is heightened by this unfinished space. She's literally and figuratively absent from the scene. Christ's ascension and resurrection are yet to come. This painting depicts his burial preparations, but we know that Christ's earthly burial will not be the end of his spiritual life. Now we're getting quite deep with the interpretation. Now remember, Michelangelo likely did not intend for us to view the painting like this. However, as we view it in its unfinished state, it offers its own theological interpretations. When my tour guests and I gaze at this painting, I draw their attention to its sculptural nature. Michelangelo believed that painting is better the closer it is to sculpture, and you can see the almost three-dimensional nature of the figures. He employed sculpting techniques to the painting as well. We can see here at the top right, he scraped away the dark paint to suggest 2 figures moving the stone that closes the tomb. Michelangelo was only 25 when he painted this work, and he would also create La Pietà and David before his 30th birthday. He did live to a grand old age. He died at 88, outliving his ultimate rival, Raphael, who we will talk about next. Now, I know that I shouldn't play favorites, but Michelangelo is my favorite. Oh yeah, did I mention that the National Gallery is free? All of the big museums in the UK are. They're funded by the government and they belong to the people. Or maybe to the king. Either way, we get to use them for free. Now let's continue on our theme with a second painting from the Italian Renaissance. So are you a Leonardo, a Michelangelo, or a Raphael person? If you'd like to see me talk about the Leonardo here at the National Gallery, called Virgin of the Rocks, be sure to watch the first part of this video, which I've linked in the description below and just above. As I've said, my heart is with Michelangelo, but the wide consensus, at least here at the National Gallery, is that Raphael is the most beloved. He's known as a young genius who died at just 37 years old, renowned for his skill painting sweet, elegant, and maternal images of the Madonna and Child. The National Gallery has 12 Raphael altarpieces and smaller paintings in its collection, lavishly highlighted during their much-anticipated 2022 exhibition, along with more than 70 others. Today, most are not on display due to a large renovation taking place here at the gallery, but in this small but impressive room we have 4 altarpieces from different periods in his career. Let's focus here on one of Raphael's earliest works, an altarpiece known as the Mond Crucifixion, after Dr. Ludwig Mond, who bequeathed it to the National Gallery in 1924. However, it could more accurately be called the Gavari Crucifixion, as it was originally commissioned in 1503 by the wool merchant and banker Domenico Gavari for his burial chapel in Umbria. At the time, Raphael was likely living in Perugia. He created his earliest documented works in this area, and this is the second of 3 Umbrian altarpieces. In the painting we can see Christ's body hanging from the cross, inscribed with INRI, which stands in Latin for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. On either side of Christ we can see 2 angels with scrolling ribbons using golden chalices to catch the blood flowing from his wounds. These chalices would be common during Mass, held just below this altarpiece. In fact, Gavari left money specifically in his will for new chalices. The Umbrian landscape plays a prominent role here, and the gold-leafed sun and silver-leafed moon are both visible to mark the eclipse that is said to have coincided with Christ's death. At the foot of the cross, Saint Jerome and Mary Magdalene gaze up at Christ, and the Virgin Mary stands off to the left, dressed in dark purple to signify mourning. On the right, we can see John the Evangelist wringing his hands in grief. Just a note, Saint Jerome was not present at the crucifixion. However, he is here because the chapel this was commissioned for was named in his honor. You can see that he is holding a stone. When he lived as a hermit in the wilderness, he used this stone to beat his chest. There were lower pieces to this altarpiece called predellas. One is in the North Carolina Museum of Art, and another is in the Musée National d'Art in Lisbon. There may have also been a third, which is now lost. The surviving panels depict miracles that happened after Christ's death. For many years, this altarpiece was attributed to Perugino, who was the leading artist in central Italy at the time. Raphael was very close to Perugino, who was his teacher and was heavily influenced by his style. Here is a rather flattering portrait that Raphael painted of his master, which now hangs at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Perugino's influence is very visible in the Mond Crucifixion. For instance, the overall design of this piece is based on several versions of a crucified Christ in a landscape, similar to this, that Perugino painted in the 1480s and 90s, and is really similar to an altarpiece of the Crucifixion for the convent of St. Francisco al Monte in Perugia. Here you can really see the similarities. Just look at the chalices that are catching the blood, and the poses of the Virgin and the Evangelist. Raphael also adopted Perugino's delicate oval faces and stylized hand gestures, as well as symmetry and clarity of composition, but he softens them and makes them his own. There is no doubt that he surpassed his teacher's talents. Some scholars even surmise that Perugino could have actually been later inspired by Raphael in turn. In many of Raphael's paintings, including the Ansidei Madonna, also here at the National Gallery, he used a grid to help him transfer his work. A lot of street artists do this today. However, there's no grid visible on the Mond Crucifixion, but the fact he left unpainted spaces for the figures and made no revisions or changes suggests he did have a careful plan. By the way, how do we know this? Well, these paintings have all been x-rayed and examined carefully with modern equipment to gain insight into the artist's minds and methods. A few minutes ago, I mentioned the special nature of an unfinished painting, such as Michelangelo's work, and how we can feel like we are in the room with the master. However, Raphael also allows us into his world here in the draperies. He used dark hatched brush strokes for the shadows, which he learned from Perugino, but he also used his hands and fingers to blot the wet surface paint. We can see his fingerprints and palm prints, especially in Christ's hair, face, and beard. It's like being in the same room. Just another quick note, if you like Raphael's sweet images of the Virgin and Child, head to room 26, where you'll see a painting not always attributed to the artist, referred to as the Madonna of the Pinks. In fact, until 1991, it was considered a copy and had hung in Alnwick Castle for centuries. It's much, much smaller than the Mond altarpiece. Perhaps it was intended as a portable prayer aid. In the painting, we see a young and pretty Virgin Mary playing with the Christ child, giving him carnations. These flowers represent Christ's passion. According to legend, the flower first appeared at the moment when the Virgin wept at the crucifixion. Now, let's make our way from the Italian Renaissance to one of the most celebrated and hated Dutch masters. About Rubens, Picasso once said, "He's gifted, but he's used his gifts to make nasty things." It's no secret that Rubens isn't exactly thought of as a painter's painter. He has long been regarded as a painter who pandered to the whims of politicians and royals with overwrought melodrama. But in the past decades, people have gained a newfound appreciation for Rubens, especially for his combination of diplomacy and artistic prowess. I cannot stress enough how important Peter Paul Rubens was to the political history of Spain and England. Not only was he one of the most commercially popular painters of his day, he was also an ambassador and savvy political operative. This painting, Minerva protecting Pax from Mars, is a fantastic example of his political achievements and also of his fleshy pink women, described as Rubensian or Rubenesque ever since. But let's back things up a little bit. Rubens was born in Siegen, Germany in 1577, but moved to Antwerp in Belgium at the age of 10 to attend school. After traveling through Spain and Italy for 8 years, he returned to Antwerp to see his dying mother when he was 31. Once there, his reputation grew, and he was appointed court painter to the rulers of the Netherlands, Archduke Albert and his wife Isabella, to whom Rubens would become a valued confidant. Rubens began a robust trade in altarpieces, earning a handsome living and rising through the Antwerp social scene. He was amazingly prolific, which required a very large workshop, and this is one of the reasons that he is maligned by so many historians and artists. People doubt what he painted versus what his students painted. At this point in history, Antwerp was part of the Spanish Netherlands, which was split into 17 provinces based on religious lines, depicted here in a map called the Leo Belgicus. The Protestants and the Catholics were embroiled in a serious war that lasted for the entirety of Rubens' lifetime, the 80 Years' War. The pursuit of peace, therefore, was part of his DNA. In 1621, he was commissioned for a massive series of paintings depicting the life of the notoriously difficult Maria de Medici, who was the widow of King Henri IV of France. Though he only completed half of the works before she was banished from the court, these monumental canvases in the Louvre remain an impressive sight. In 1625, Rubens tried to escape the plague by moving his family to Brussels, but when they moved back to Antwerp, his wife fell ill and died, and he was devastated. After her death, he threw himself into his diplomatic work. He traveled to England to paint the roof decorations on James I's new banqueting house at Whitehall, the only part of the palace to survive a massive fire in 1698. He and King James got on very well, as he would with Charles I, James' son, just a few years later. And by the way, that banqueting hall still survives, and it's just a few steps down the street from this gallery. In 1630, King Philip IV of Spain decided to take advantage of this special relationship to help end the 5-year-long Anglo-Spanish War. He knew that Charles I liked Rubens' style, and he also knew that Rubens was a smart political operative. Both sides were keen for a deal, and a painting like this one was the perfect way to get there. So let's look at it in some more detail. We can see a mix of different figures based on mythological beings, Roman gods, and real people, each of them serving a purpose or representing emotions and concepts. Let's start by looking at Pax, or Peace, who is here in the middle and a titular character of the painting. Rubens has painted her to look like Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, and where we get the word cereal from, instead of Pax. She's looking positively Rubenesque. With her exposed breast, she's feeding Plutus, who is the god of wealth. A satyr and a cherubic child help her share her fruits of the earth, another symbol of Ceres, with the children at the front of the painting. We can see the fruits spilling out from this cornucopia. Above her head, we see another cherubic child holding a caduceus, the symbol of Mercury with 2 entwined snake heads, and he represents the ideals of fair negotiation. The women on the left are likely followers of Bacchus, the god of wine, and we can also see the leopards that typically pull Bacchus's chariot. Now let's look up at the woman behind Pax. She is Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, and she is pushing Mars, the god of war, and of fury, a goddess of vengeance, away from this assemblage of people. Rubens also added a little Easter egg for contemporaries who would have viewed this painting. The children here on the bottom left are the eldest sons and daughters of Sir Balthasar Gerbier, Charles I's favourite art dealer, at whose house Rubens stayed while in London. These little ones are George, Élisabeth, and Susan. The painting is clear. We should reject war and embrace peace, and we will all enjoy the bounty of prosperity surrounding Pax, depicted as Ceres. It turned out to be a popular message. Rubens was knighted by Charles I and returned to Antwerp in March 1630. Later that year, England and Spain signed a peace treaty. Here we have one of the most famous painters in the National Gallery, Rembrandt Harmensoen van Rijn, commonly known simply as Rembrandt. We're standing in front of one of his most famous self-portraits, of which he created nearly 80, but this one has extra layers of history and references to past great masters. Rembrandt, who was born in Leiden, Dutch Republic, in 1606, was an extremely successful commercial artist early in his career, but was deeply unsuccessful in his personal life. He suffered great personal tragedies, including the loss of 3 children as infants, and his beloved first wife died in 1642 from tuberculosis. He was also rotten with money and had several salacious affairs with his maids and hired help, but that's a different topic. Here, we see him just 2 years before Saskia's death at the age of 34. He is poised and ready to show us just how successful and confident he is. This is essentially an advertising billboard for his fashionable portrait painting services. Let's start by looking at some of the preparatory sketches for this work. Just look at how rakish he looks here. He's definitely more of a playboy than in the finished painting. For us, we might look at his clothing and assume that he is just dressed in the clothing of the day. After all, very few of us are familiar with the fashion of the Dutch Republic of the 1640s. I know I'm not. However, for one of Rembrandt's contemporaries, his clothing is decidedly old-fashioned. It's more than 120 years out of style. He dons expensive fur and velvet, and his hat is laden with jewels. These are the trappings of a man from the 1520s, not the 1640s. That's right. He has transported himself back to the era of the Italian Renaissance masters, of which he was very familiar. It's more than just his clothing, though. The positioning of the parapet and his arm are almost certainly cribbed from a 1510 portrait by Titian called A Man with a Quilted Sleeve. The shape of his figure and his choice of colors also evoke a portrait by Raphael, which we know that Rembrandt had seen and sketched. This portrait by Titian is one of my favorites in the National Gallery, and the reference is very interesting. It was then believed to be Ludovico Ariosto, a celebrated Italian Renaissance poet. Rembrandt is, therefore, positioning himself as the heir apparent to the wonders and talent of the Renaissance, boldly comparing himself to Raphael, Titian, and Dürer. Rembrandt is playing around with perspective in the same ways. By resting his elbow on the wall, this painting comes alive and seems less like a flat, static picture and more like a 3D window into Rembrandt's reality. X-ray studies have been done on this painting, showing that his left hand was also initially resting on the wall. However, he tucked it back into his cloak for the finished product to appear more aloof, and many people believe that Rembrandt was terrible at painting hands, so this could have helped him hide a weakness. Rembrandt is typically known for his frenetic, visible brushstrokes, just like we can see here on this portrait. But in his self-portrait, he has used a lighter touch to emulate the meticulous finish of the Renaissance masters. However, when we look at the back of his neck, we can still see that he's used the pointed end of his brush handle to scratch hairs into the wet paint. That's kind of Rembrandt's way of saying, hey, it's still me. Now, this painting, as kind of a business card to attract new clients, was successful, but that doesn't mean that Rembrandt was good with money. In fact, He and his son Titus spent the rest of his life scrambling just to try to make ends meet. This next painting is called Self-Portrait in a Straw Hat, and it's a signed copy of a very popular self-portrait by the artist Élisabeth Louise Vigée Lebrun. While it may look, at first glance, like a typical 18th century portrait, there are a few glaring details that tell us something different is happening here. First of all, this woman isn't wearing a lot of makeup, and she's not wearing a powdered wig. That's really shocking for 1782 in France. This woman's natural beauty is allowed to shine at a time when women were heavily made up for portraits. And let's also notice, she is the one holding the easel in a very bold and prominent way. She is the artist, and yeah, she's a woman. Élisabeth Vigée Lebrun was a female artist at a time when being a successful female artist was almost unheard of. Of the 2,300 paintings held by the National Gallery, only 22 are by women. Now, Vigée Lebrun was born in Paris in 1755 to a portrait painter, though her father would die when she was just 12. She began selling portraits at the age of 14 to contribute to the family income, and her passion for not only the art of painting, but business was stoked. She married an art dealer, Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun, who helped her earn commissions and make valuable contacts. Though she took his name, they did eventually divorce. She was extremely successful in the years just before the French Revolution of 1789, especially in the Versailles court. She was also only one of 4 women admitted to the Royal Academy in France during the 18th century. However, it was her role as Marie Antoinette's favorite portrait painter that helped cement her career and high society reputation, and would almost cost her her head. When the royal family was arrested in October 1789, Vigée Lebrun fled Paris to travel the continent with her young daughter, who she painted here, and she did not return to France until 1802, as I mentioned, fearing for her own head. This portrait was exhibited in 1782 at the Salon de la Correspondance in Paris and at the 1783 Salon of the Royal Academy. She deliberately modeled her self-portrait on Peter Paul Rubens' portrait of Susanna London, which was often known simply as the straw hat. The hat in this picture, however, is made of beaver felt, and Vigée Lebrun wanted to challenge this error in a playful way. She's essentially saying, straw hat? I'll show you a straw hat. She was inspired by the way Rubens' hat has a broad rim that casts the woman's face in shadow, and it's instead lit solely by reflected light. Vigée Lebrun wrote, "This painting delights me and inspired me to make my own portrait in Brussels in search of the same effect. When the portrait was exhibited at the Salon, I dare say it greatly enhanced my reputation." Though her hair and lack of makeup may seem informal, Vigée Lebrun is very calculating with her image. She is deliberately positioning herself as a great artist and as an expert, just the way that Rembrandt did when referencing Titian a century or so earlier. Vigée Lebrun is holding her tools, posing outdoors in natural light and staring at us openly and directly. She's not shy or coy. She wears a low-cut dress that evokes what a shepherdess would wear. This was a popular reference at the time, and even Marie Antoinette liked to dress up as a peasant and had a fake rustic village built on the grounds of Versailles. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see me visit Versailles in the future. It's important to keep in mind, though, that even though Vigée Lebrun was a successful artist and her talent afforded her freedom not normally afforded to women in France at the time, she is still known mostly for painting women and children. Scenes of domesticity. Here you can see this little girl with a bag of knitting. That said, Vigée Lebrun is a constant popular presence on my tours of the National Gallery. People really do love seeing a female perspective in these halls. I'm working on a video about all of the women painters in the National Gallery, so leave a comment below and let me know if you're excited to see that one. One of the curators here at the National Gallery has a theory that all British people are born with an embryonic knowledge of Constable's Wain. They emerge from the womb knowing this painting. It's in the British DNA. But for me, as a Canadian, I had to be introduced to Constable. And while I am a much bigger Turner fan, we'll see him next, knowing Constable's story and the background of this painting makes it so much richer for me. By the way, this isn't just my own opinion. A Radio 4 poll found that the Wain, this painting, was the second most beloved by the British public. Number one, well, that one will be up next. But back to the Wain. First of all, if you've only ever seen this painting reproduced on a commemorative plate or a postage stamp, I need to impress upon you how large it is. It's nearly 6 feet across, dominating the back corner of the National Gallery's Room of British Painting. Constable came from rural Suffolk, and his father was quite affluent and owned a mill, and you can see just the edge of this mill on the right side of the canvas. He paints an accurate representation of the countryside, even down to minute studies of clouds, something he's well known for. Constable struggled for years to be accepted into the Royal Academy, and supported himself with a small handful of private clients. And despite this now beloved style, he was overlooked again and again. Even though this may look quite classic and pristine to our eyes, Constable was actually criticized for his lack of finish, owing to the visible brush strokes and the scraping you can see across the canvas. He famously said, "I don't see any finish in nature." This kind of sentiment would go on to inspire the Barbizon school in France, and if you'd like to learn more about that, you can watch my video here, part 1 of the Musée d'Orsay. The view of this painting is of the mill pond at Flatford Mill, located in the rural Suffolk of his childhood memories. Constable felt an urgent need to record the rapidly changing landscape, which he must have sensed was about to change forever, due to the industrialization of the country through the railway, navigational canals, and factories. While Turner paints these emblems of modern life, the absence of them in Constable's work somehow makes them just as glaring and obvious. There is no clashing, racing steam locomotive in this painting. Instead, we see the Wain, a hay cart just slightly off-center on the canvas. The house to the left, which still survives by the way, was occupied by a tenant farmer called Willie Law during Constable's childhood. He would depict this exact cabin many times throughout his life, reaching for some idealized childhood perfection. Though while it looks pastoral and peaceful, remember that these haymakers are working hard. One man is sharpening his scythe, others are pitchforking hay into the distance, and you can just see one man on top stacking the load. You may think that Constable painted this en plein air, that is, outdoors, while surveying the scene in natural light, but remember, the canvas is huge. It was instead created in his studio in London, from memory and from previous oil sketches that are held by different galleries around the world. The small rowboat, almost easy to miss here, was Constable's way of adding balance to the painting. He was inspired by 17th century Flemish and Dutch landscape paintings, including 2 landscapes by Jan van Goyen, and Rubens, again, an autumn landscape with a view of Het Steen. Remember, painting simple landscapes was considered a low form of art by the Paris salons, and here in London at the Royal Academy. So he was likely heartened that these Dutch masters were also interested in painting the simple countryside scenes that captured his heart. While he is undoubtedly referencing these paintings, he never wanted to veer too far away from nature in its raw state. While Constable fought for recognition here at home, he was beloved by the French. Imagine that. The French painter Théodore Géricault, already famous for the Raft of the Medusa, was, quote, quite stunned by the painting in 1821 and took inspiration from it as he returned back to France. Writer and influential librarian Charles Nodier suggested that French artists should be more like Constable and look to nature rather than taking the grand tour to Italy and rehashing the same classical subjects. A few years later, in 1824, Constable sold the Wain and two other pieces to the Anglo-French dealer Arrowsmith for the sum of £250, about £20,000 in today's currency. They were exhibited at the Paris Salon that year, and they were a massive hit. Constable was delighted. He said, quote, "Think of the peaceful farmhouses of Suffolk, forming a scene of exhibitions to amuse the gay and frivolous Parisians," and amusing us to this day. Now we're just walking between the Constable painting and the most famous painting by J.M.W. Turner. As you can see, it's just on the other side of this gallery, room number 34. For once, it doesn't have a crowd. Okay, now for the painting that was voted the most important in the National Gallery by the British public on that Radio 4 poll that I mentioned earlier. Turner kept this painting until his death, calling it his darling. It took a long time to grow on me, but now it is absolutely one of my favorites in this gallery or any. It's called the Fighting Temeraire, and it was painted by Turner in 1839, continuing with the tradition of Constable's uneasiness with the Industrial Revolution and the quickly changing pace of life in England, which are both major themes of English Romantic painting. Turner was everything that Constable was not: coarse, gruff, and wildly beloved by the London art scene at a time when Constable couldn't get a time of day. You'd think that Constable, coming from a more well-to-do background, would have fit in perfectly, but it seems that people wanted a grittier man who painted brash, coarse scenes filled with swashbuckling ships and rattling locomotives. Standing here at the National Gallery, I'm only a few hundred meters away from where Joseph Mallard William Turner, JMW, spent his childhood, in his father's Covent Garden barber shop. Turner delighted in his working-class identity, especially when it came to his rather rough accent echoing through the halls of the Royal Academy, where he was accepted to study at just the age of 14. His life was unconventional. For instance, he only ever had relationships with widowed women, including Sarah Danby, with whom he had 2 daughters. This painting depicts one of the most famous warships in England at the time, the Temeraire, which had been present at the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, for which the square just outside this museum is named. It was made from 5,000 oak trees. It was a boat of renown and glory, but here it is, made redundant after the Peace of 1815, being tugged up the Thames from Sheerness in Kent by a small tugboat, preparing to be broken up at Rotherhithe, where it was due to be scrapped. Now, Turner certainly took some liberties. He altered the colors of the ship from black to white, giving it a more ghostly appearance, like it was already gone and fading from memory. He also changed the sails. In reality, the Navy had stripped this boat of its masts already, but Turner keeps them for the painting, but he doesn't include a Union Jack, marking the fact that the ship was no longer naval property. However, he does include the tug's white commercial flag, which adds to the anguish for a patriot like Turner of the Temeraire's missing Union flag. He also moves the tug's funnel to the front of the mast, allowing it to take center stage as the soot blows back towards the Temeraire as steam literally overtakes sail in front of our eyes. This tiny dynamo has the strength and might to pull this formerly majestic ship. But we shouldn't accuse Turner, who, though he was an avowed romantic, of too much nostalgia here. I mean, he's not Constable, after all. The most common interpretation of the scene is that the sun is setting on the end of an age and the end of an era. As such, it's certainly tempting to view this painting as a criticism of modern life. However, much of Turner's work shows an admiration of both the old and the new. In this case, he may have mourned the age of sail, but he also admired some of the new modes of transport, including steamships and the railways that he traveled on and painted. Now, let's talk about this sun. It has traditionally been viewed as a sunset, as the Temeraire approaches its final birth, and Turner's crimson sunset skies are often associated with death. A pale crescent moon is present in the corner, also showing the transition between two different time periods. However, no one denies that Turner's sun is setting in the wrong direction. Any ship coming up the Thames would be heading west, and the sunset could not be setting in the east. There was a rousing debate at the time about why he would do that. After all, he owned a pub in Wapping, so he knew the river well. Could this instead be the sun rising? Some experts think so. And if so, that certainly changes the meaning of the painting, doesn't it? As you can see, the Fighting Temeraire and J.M.W. Turner himself are on the 20-pound note. Here, we have one of the most famous post-impressionist painters, Georges Seurat. Seurat was a tragic figure, known for pioneering pointillism, but dying tragically young at just the age of 31. His cause of death is unknown, but is often attributed to meningitis, pneumonia, or diphtheria. Previously, bathers had always been a popular subject matter in academic art and Renaissance art, the idealized, the beautiful, the serene. But this painting, called The Bathers at Asnieres, turns that convention on its head and shows the working class with the gas plant and factories at Clichy in the background, which indicates that this is not a fancy place to spend recreation time. This is not a countryside scene or a place of aspiration and wealth. Instead, this is a place where the workers from those very factories can come and cool down on a hot day. Early sketches of this work show a horse drinking the river water. This sandy embankment, set amongst run-down houses, boatyards, and lower-class cafes, was listed on maps as une baignade, a bathing place. However, this did not mean it was a place to swim, but rather a place to bathe your dogs and horses. This meaning, which would have been familiar to Parisians of the day, gives the title of the painting even more nuance. Now, look in the background. You can see some onlookers in a rowboat wearing top hats and finery. They've employed a working-class person wearing the same hat as the bathers in the foreground to signify his status as their rower. Geographically, this is set just opposite the river from a small island, the subject of Seurat's most famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, which is held at the Art Institute of Chicago. In that painting, Seurat depicts much more formal people in far more structured clothing and poses. Perhaps the people in the rowboat are on their way to that party. Now let's just talk about the massive scale. We are used to seeing Impressionist paintings as a lot smaller. Remember, they're usually easel paintings, so painters could be en plein air and really capture how the light hits their subjects. But this work was completed with 13 studies and sketches, and then executed indoors in a studio. In doing so, Seurat rejects the spontaneity of the Impressionists, and that's one of the reasons he's often called a post-impressionist painter. However, he's also rejecting the tradition of depicting only the bourgeois and nobility on such a large canvas. Perhaps that's why this boat is flying a tricolor flag, which symbolized the French Revolution. That said, he does portray these boys and men in a vaunted way. They are in profile. They have alabaster skin tones despite their time outdoors in the sun, evoking classical sculpture. Let me also draw attention to the fact that Seurat was only 24 when he painted this. He was a young genius who would go on to develop a style called pointillism, which uses contrasting dots of color next to one another to create a shimmering effect. In this painting, his signature style is just starting to emerge. He repainted parts of the canvas using this technique, adding dots of yellow and blue to the boy's orange hat. Believe it or not, he entered this painting into the Paris Salon, and it was rejected. This was despite the fact that Seurat undertook traditional training at the École des Beaux-Arts. The Salon was an annual painting exhibition where the best artists would show their works and be judged by experts, but it had rigid rules and restrictions on subject matter. working class recreation was certainly not acceptable. If you want to learn more about the salon, watch my video on the Musée d'Orsay linked above. And now it's time for number 10 on our list. It's Surprised by Henri Rousseau. It's very common to approach this painting at the National Gallery and see it surrounded by children. And it's easy to see why. It's a straightforward painting of a whimsical tiger, two-dimensional and strangely alluring against the jungle backdrop. It would be right at home in a kid's picture book. Henri Rousseau is often considered a master of naïve art, which is almost an oxymoron. Rousseau was a tax collector known as a douanier. He started painting as a hobby at the age of 40, and he did not fit in with the avant-garde Paris art scene, which was dominated by the Impressionists and wild men like Cézanne and Toulouse-Lautrec. Simply put, Rousseau was deeply uncool. But wait, like Marge Simpson says, is that kind of what makes him cool? The not being cool and being completely unself-conscious about it? Well, Picasso sure thought so. In 1908, Picasso held a dinner for Rousseau, where Rousseau proclaimed, "You and I are the two most important artists of the age. You in the Egyptian style, and I in the modern." I don't actually know what he meant by the Egyptian style. Later, at Rousseau's funeral in 1910, some of the era's most important artists stood at his grave. Sonia and Robert Delaunay, Constantine Brancusi, Paul Signac, and Manuel Ortiz de Seurat. He was beloved by painters, but were they being a wee bit ironic or even patronizing in their praise? Well, let's talk a little bit more about the man himself. Though he touted himself as a purely untaught artist with, quote, no teacher other than nature, he may have actually had some basic artistic training. He also claimed he had traveled to Mexico while fighting in Napoleon III's army, but he never actually left France, despite claiming his jungle scenes were his own personal experiences. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly never seen a tiger in the Mexican jungles. Rousseau employed a mechanical enlarger called a pantograph to trace large projected images onto a canvas. This is one of the reasons the tiger looks superimposed on the painting. The flatness is a hallmark of his self-taught reputation, no matter how dubious, giving his work a childlike quality and earning it the moniker of naïve art. I also think it's quite wild that we started our tour with a painting that doesn't really have any perspective from 1385, and we're ending our tour with a painting from 1891 that has looped all the way back around and is lauded for being innovative for not having any perspective. This painting may have originally had more action. After all, the tiger is crouched and ready, with his teeth bared and back arched. He could be reacting to the lightning in the top right corner, but he could also be stalking prey that Rousseau later painted out. In fact, he referred to the painting as a tiger chasing explorers. I wish the explorers were still here. He wasn't nearly finished with this theme. Rousseau painted more than 20 more jungle scenes during his career. Remember, he didn't actually serve in any exotic destinations. These plants, despite how meticulously detailed they are in reds, greens, and browns, are domestic houseplants popular in France at the time, and tropical plants that he had seen at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. These gardens, by the way, included a zoo filled with animals, including, you guessed it, tigers, as well as zoology galleries that included taxidermied animals in lifelike poses. Admission was free, and he visited often. He may have also studied the tigers in paintings by Eugène Delacroix and Jean-Léon Gérôme to learn even more. The silver slashes of rain evoke Japanese woodblock prints, a form of art that also inspired Van Gogh and Monet. It may have been specifically inspired by Hiroshige's 1857 sudden shower over Shinohashi Bridge, which he may have seen circulating through Paris. After exhibiting Surprised at the 1891 Salon des Indépendants, a reaction against the official government-sponsored salon, Rousseau received some of his first media coverage. While some people mocked and laughed at him, others were smitten by what they saw as a reaction to the pretentious nature of the Parisian art scene. A young writer and artist called Félix Vallotton gushed over this work in the Swiss Journal, writing, quote, "His tiger ought not to be missed. It is the alpha and omega of painting. As a matter of fact, not everyone laughs, and some who do are quickly brought up short. There is always something beautiful about seeing a faith, any faith, so pitilessly expressed." Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below if you would have been laughing with Rousseau or at him. Well, that's it for me here today at the National Gallery, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.